we have seen a downward trend, if that seems like a euphemism or a huge understatement, a downward trend in freedom of speech and the press in Russia in recent years, from the laws introduced labeling independent media as some as extremists, some as foreign agents, squeezing the space completely up until the point of the outbreak of war, the start of Russia's invasion of its neighbor, leading so many Russian reporters to be forced to leave the country, and leaving a very, very small amount of people still able to work and to report on the ground in Russia, most of them foreign correspondents. So the space for free reporting in Russia had squeezed already. So if you're looking for a trend, there is one there for sure.
I'm Benjamin Wittes, and this is the Lawfare Podcast, April 24th, 2023. Evan Gershkovich has been in Russian detention for the last several weeks. He is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and he is the latest American taken hostage by the Vladimir Putin regime. His good friend Polina Ivanova is a reporter for the Financial Times, a colleague of Evan's in Russia, and has been an outspoken advocate for his release. She joined me from Berlin in the virtual jungle studio to talk about Evan, who he is, why he has been detained by the Russians, what we know about his conditions in prison, and what it will take to get him home. It's the Lawfare Podcast, April 24th, Polina Ivanova on Evan Gershkovich's detention. Okay, so I want to start with how you know Evan and how you came to know him. You've been speaking a great deal about him in public and advocating for his release. Tell me about the nature of your relationship with him.
Sure. So Evan and I both arrived to Russia around about the same time, towards the end of 2017, both coming to Russia to take up our first jobs as reporters on the ground. For him, it was a case of taking a kind of risky bet to leave an entry-level position at the New York Times, something that lots of people fight for. And he took a risk to go across the world to Russia and work for a local paper, and started a job at the Moscow Times. And I was also starting my first journalism job. So those first years, we quickly became friends in this environment, and sort of were chasing after the same stories together and learning the ropes of career in journalism around about the same time and the same place. The Moscow press corps is a very small and tight-knit community. You go through a lot of stuff. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the story of how we got to know each other. And then it was many years of, reporting on the same staff, going to protests, covering protests together, covering the same trials, the same events during the pandemic, and then, of course, the start of the war.
And when did you leave Moscow? I think the last time we spoke, you were in Paris, and now you're in Berlin, but you have not regarded it as safe for you in Moscow, I take it.
No, that's not quite right. It's a very complicated assessment to make all the time. I actually covered the outbreak of the war in Kiev. I was working in Ukraine at the beginning of the invasion. And then I was, in Paris when we spoke, in lots of different places, and subsequently went back to Moscow on reporting trips. My latest one was in February.
I see. So you've been kind of in and out of the country since the beginning of the war?
Yes, though not immediately, because it was a shock initially for everyone, and also forced a sort of reassessment of the security situation. These laws were brought in, I think on day 2 or day 3 of the war, which criminalized a lot of different kinds of speech around the war, including the use of the word war itself, as many people listening here will know, and forced a massive exodus of Russian journalists from the country, and then also caused a lot of foreign correspondents to reassess their own security as well, because it was a very unclear situation. So at the beginning, everybody was sort of finding their feet, and Evan was one of the first people to go back for the Western press. He went back to report in Moscow in the summer of 2022, and then stayed on there basically, or started staying for long stints and reporting because he felt that it was his duty to do so for as long as that was possible. One of his first stories on his return was about this kind of strange normality of life in Moscow, sort of 4 months or so, I think it was, into the war, where young people are going to bars and kind of continuing to live their lives, and the war feels very far away, and the kind of strange absurdity of that. It was a very poignant report.
Yeah, so when he went back and stayed on a long-term basis, did you have the sense that he understood that as a risk, or that he assessed that it was safe to do, and that, whatever they would do, arresting Western reporters for major news outlets was not within their hostage playbook? How, to the best of your understanding, how did he understand the risk that he was taking?
Everybody is constantly calculating the risks. Obviously, they're there, and everybody is taking them seriously. Evan was very aware of the difficulties of reporting in Russia, the challenges, and something that we talked about all the time. It's really, topic of conversation number one among reporters covering this story. And Evan was very aware of the risk. He had spoken about being followed on reporting trips. This was something quite new, and it was, something that hadn't really happened before the war. But this is, of course, a very difficult situation to assess, and this red line has never been crossed before. The red line of targeting a Western journalist, or a journalist for the foreign press in general, is something that has not happened, as you know, since the Cold War. So this is a very, very different situation. Yeah, very different situation indeed.
So talk to us about the circumstances of his arrest. There's been a fair bit of reporting that it had to do with the nature of the story that he had just written. Why Evan? And was there a substantive reason for it? I mean, not that he had done anything wrong, but was there a particular sensitivity about the material that he was reporting, or was he more of a target of opportunity?
I think it's really hard to speculate, right? It's really hard to know what the Kremlin is thinking. There's been strong reporting from Bloomberg that this case has been directed from the very top.
By which you mean Vladimir Putin?
By which, I mean Vladimir Putin. There was a good report on that in Bloomberg, citing high-level sources. It's very hard to know. It's a case of espionage, according to the Russian state, which means that it's a closed case, which means there's no information about what bogus charges are being pinned on him. They are not being disclosed. There's been nothing. The first trial was completely closed to the public. We've just seen an appeal happen on Tuesday, which related to the pre-trial detention in which Evan would be held, whether it would be the Lefort prison in Moscow or another place, such as house arrest. That was public for a few minutes so that some images of Evan could be seen and so that the judge could read out the verdict. But the whole substantive, even part of that trial, which is just about where his pre-trial detention would be held, was closed as well. So we really don't have very many details of the case at all.
Now, this sounds like a ridiculous question to ask, but I'm going to put it out there. The CIA's policy is that it does not use journalists anymore for espionage, and hasn't since, I think, the early 70s. Do you have any doubt that Evan was simply a journalist and not an intelligence operative on some country's behalf?
There's obviously no doubt at all. Evan is a journalist. Evan is a journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He's an accredited journalist with accredited by the Russian Foreign Ministry, working completely openly, publishing his material and working for years honestly and fairly covering the Russian story. This is the thing that makes it almost the most upsetting, is that Evan has always dedicated so much time to treating this story with care, to revealing the real nuances of the Russian story, to not report in simple stereotypes, to not paint it as to not just rely on stereotypes, to really get into the nuances and the nitty-gritty of the Russian story, and to tell it in all its kind of grayscale and all of its depth, and to really make readers, to force readers to kind of come to terms with that. Right from the start, even when he was working at a domestic local paper at the Moscow Times, he was writing in this way, and not in a simple way about Russia, but in a complex and caring and nuanced way, which just makes it all the more upsetting that all of that work done with care as an honest journalist, as a very careful journalist on Russia, would have been ignored.
And characterized, in some sense anyway, as espionage.
I mean, the charges are bogus.
So, talk about the state of the case. There's a pretrial detention order at this stage. The trial itself is closed. What does the defense of Evan look like as a practical matter? Do you think of it chiefly as a set of legal proceedings, or chiefly as a set of political advocacy matter that the United States has to take up as a diplomatic question, but the law of Russia is utterly irrelevant to how it proceeds?
I mean, the question is a very apt one. Look, the case itself is important. We don't know very much about it. We know that the pretrial detention appeal was rejected, and so Evan will remain in Lefortovo prison in his cell until the trial begins, or at least the next proper hearing, which will be on the 29th of May, if I'm not mistaken, the very last days of May. And so that's another, more than a month away, in which time Evan will spend alone in Lefortovo prison. That's pretty much all that we know of the case. And to be honest, the Russian judicial system, I think the defendant is found guilty in something like 99% of cases. I'm going to get my stats wrong, but the point is that the political process and the campaign in defense of Evan and to get him released is of huge importance. It is, again, hard to know exactly what the Russian state wants, but we have seen reports in the media of members of the Russian Foreign Ministry talking about political prisoner exchange. You've seen Margarita Simonyan, the sort of chief propagandist on Russian television, or one of, talking about the possibility of an exchange. So clearly, if it's in the kind of Russian dialogue, then this is something that is really being considered, which means that there will be, the political process is important as well. Also very important is the campaign.
Yeah, so let's talk about the political process, the diplomatic side of it. The Russians have had no small success over the last several years in, basically charging U.S. What are essentially hostages, from Paul Whelan to Brittany Griner, on trumped up charges and then leveraging them for, genuine criminals that are part of the regime in one sense or another that the United States has arrested and prosecuted. I mean, is your instinct that this is essentially part of that operation, and this is that we should think of Evan as roughly the same way we think of Brittany Griner, just in a different profession? Or do you think of it more as a targeted attack on journalism about Russia? In other words, Is this directed against the United States? We arrest your arms dealers. Okay, in response, we arrest your basketball players and your journalists, or is this directed at the press, or both?
I think again, this is it's hard to know exactly what we spend a lot of time on criminology and trying to read between the lines and working out what is going on. But I think my gut instinct is that it's in some ways a bit of both. So we have seen a downward trend, if that seems like a euphemism or a huge understatement, a downward trend in freedom of speech in the press in Russia in recent years, from the laws introduced labeling independent media as some as extremists, some as foreign agents, squeezing the space completely up until the point of the outbreak of war, or the start of Russia's invasion of its neighbor, leading so many Russian reporters to be forced to leave the country, and leaving a very, very small amount of people still able to work and to report on the ground in Russia, most of them foreign correspondents. So the space for free reporting in Russia had squeezed already. So if you're looking for a trend, there is one there for sure. Similarly, there is a trend towards hostage diplomacy. So, if we're going to call Evan anything, I'm confident in calling him a hostage. There is this trend towards hostage diplomacy, where we see that, as you mentioned, Brittany Griner, a basketball player, is held and then exchanged for a known arms dealer, Victor Bout. And this is happening not just in Russia, in other countries as well, as a sort of something of a trend. And it's kind of ironic, or not ironic is probably the wrong word, but saddening, just that one of the stories that Evan wrote and worked on was right at the beginning of his career at the Wall Street Journal, which he started quite recently, was to write about Brittany Griner's case for the journal. So there's something of a continuity in these cases, unfortunately.
So if we follow the continuity of these cases to its logical conclusion, the Russian pattern in these cases, at least as I can decipher it, is you trade after you convict, right? You convict Brittany Griner, you sentence Brittany Griner so that you've legitimized the hostage taking, or at least insofar as the Russian judicial system can legitimize itself, and then you conduct the negotiation. That would suggest that we, probably have a few months before we're going to get realistically a serious discussion about, a possible prisoner exchange or whatever one wants to call it. Do you have any sense of who the Russians want in exchange for Evan?
Oh, there have been lots of names floated around. I mean, I don't know from there have been no names in any kind of official Russian statements. There's just been speculation in largely the foreign media, in fact, about this. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the exchange that Simonyan had floated was to swap Assange for Evan and a few others. So really, there's been all sorts of chatter. It's hard to know what exactly, again, is on their minds. But if this is a case of aiming for an exchange, then there are candidates that have been, the reporting has shown that there are candidates for such an exchange that could be potentially of interest in the US and in other countries. But I would point out that on the timeline that you mentioned, I mean, you're very right. In recent history, we've seen that this kind of conversation only starts in full after a conviction. We saw that in the Whelan case. We believe that a conversation is happening around that. And we saw that happen after the Brittany Griner case. So there is this need for a conviction first before anything can proceed. We're quite sort of heartened to see things moving relatively quickly in terms of on the US side and seeing that Evan was labeled wrongfully detained very quickly, which was a real, which was really great and heartening to see. So on the US side, things are moving pretty swiftly for Evan. How long a process of conviction might take in Russia, it's really hard to know how whether they'll want to play this trial out, whether they'll want to extend it. It's difficult to say.
Yeah, so the other variable on the U.S. side that sometimes precipitates very quick prisoner exchanges is the capture of people that the Russians care about. So I forget how many days it took the Obama administration to arrange a trade after the capture of the illegals in 2010. For those who don't know, that's the case on which the series The Americans is very, very loosely based. But it was a very short time, and I do wonder whether this case, given Evan's profile and the relationship between, the fact that the U.S. administration, as much as it cares about basketball players and celebrities, which is a real thing, the need to defend the international press is a higher order concern, whether you might see a roll-up of something that they've been watching for a long time by way of gaining themselves leverage for a conversation about this that can take place much faster because you're holding somebody the Russians actually care about.
I mean, there has been talk of different candidates in the US. This guy Klushin comes to mind, but I'm not an expert on who they may be wanting to swap and how many people the US is holding that could be of interest. There have been candidates named related to Slovakia, related to Germany. All sorts have been reported in the press. So it's definitely something that we're all closely watching because, of course, if there is an exchange, if that is where we're headed, then the sooner that can be achieved, the better. And, we saw it took 10 months in the Brittany Griner case. Who knows how long this will take.
So you have had some contact with, or his family has had some contact with Evan. Tell us about what we know about how he's doing and what he has had to say from Lefortova.
Of course. So, yes, we have been running this letter writing campaign. So we've been sending Evan lots and lots of letters, hundreds from people around the world, which is a huge, huge thing to support him.
And do we know that he receives them?
Yes, we know. And he's also replied to us. So he's written a letter to his family. He's written several letters to his friends. In his letters, in his first letter to us, he wrote about how important it is for him to receive this correspondence. He wrote about how, it's one thing, we've all read the tales of Russian political prisoners who say that it's, brings you a lot of joy to receive letters. But he said, until you've actually become one yourself, it's hard to describe the kind of next level happiness, as I think is the words he used to receive that correspondence. Journalists from around the world have been writing, his friends, acquaintances, family, and just people from across the States, well-wishers, people who want to tell him that they support him, have been writing, and that's been a huge deal for him. I think so. Initially, we had no contact with him, and then the first thing we heard was, I think, on the third or fourth day of his detention, some prisoner monitors came to visit Evan, and we heard from them a little bit about his conditions, what he was able to tell them. At the time, he was being kept alone in a cell, and he was kind of fine with the food. Things obviously are difficult, but he was very upbeat. He was joking around with everyone. I think the prison monitors were actually just sort of baffled by the fact that his character was so strong and that he was being funny and everything. So that was very uplifting to hear. It was also uplifting to know that he had accessed a book in the prison library that he hadn't finished reading before his detention. He was reading this, we were on holiday together before, and he was reading this very massive book called Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman about the Second World War, a Ukrainian-born writer. I was sort of thinking that it's going to be, I bet he hasn't finished reading it by the time that he was detained. And it was just very wonderful to see that, to find out that he'd got the book. And then I wrote about that actually on Twitter, and someone replied saying, I'm going to tell the translator of the book. And a few days later, we see that the translator of the book wrote a letter to Evan saying, I'm the translator of the book that you're reading. And his name is Robert Chandler. And that, these are all the reasons why it's such a pertinent book to the age and to Russia at the moment and to you. And, I've been with this text for 40 years. Let's discuss it. And it was very heartening. And now we are we're able to send him books sometimes and all sorts of other things to support him, sort of basic goods stuff. And he's now moved on to War and Peace, we found out from the lawyers on the courtroom steps, which is also great. One of the books that he requested, and we posted to him.
So you mentioned the lawyers on the courtroom steps. Who are his lawyers? Are they lawyers who he retained? Are they lawyers that the family hired, or are they state-assigned lawyers? When you're a hostage in the Russian judicial system, who represents you?
He has lawyers. So initially, when on the first day of his arrest, when he was first brought to Moscow, he had a state-appointed lawyer for that first hearing. That was on the very first sort of hours of his arrest. There was this closed trial or a closed courtroom session where he was represented by a state-appointed lawyer. But after that, he has since been represented by his Russian lawyers who are hired by his employer.
Gotcha. So tell us a little about his background. He was, as I understand it, from a Russian emigre family in the United States, but he has sort of substantial ties in Russia that are, quite deep. Is that right?
Yeah. So, Evan is the child of emigres from the Soviet Union, coming from Odessa in Ukraine, then in the Soviet Union, and from St. Petersburg. And also that side of the family has links to Donetsk as well. So from all over. And they're Soviet emigres, Jewish emigres who left with the Jewish Aliyah, with the Jewish immigration wave in 1979. First to sort of briefly to Europe and then onwards to the US.
For those who are not familiar with the history of Russian Jewish immigration, 1979 was the peak year in the Soviet government's allowance of Jews to leave the Soviet Union. I forget what the numbers were, but they were quite large that year. And then it collapsed after the invasion of Afghanistan, when the United States responded quite aggressively and boycotted the Olympics, and the Russians basically cut off the spigot after 1979.
Yeah, it was a very big, it was very important. It was very important for lots of people to be able to leave. It was a great chance for a lot of people to leave the Soviet Union, and a very rare and difficult chance to leave the Soviet Union. And I know that his parents had to really struggle to get the paperwork and to be able to go. This was a very sort of important moment, and it was also very supported by Jewish emigres already in the US, kind of Soviet dissidents who had relocated, and it's kind of a big cultural moment in Soviet history as well. And so his parents arrived in the US and they met there, began working as programmers, and Evan grew up in New Jersey, with speaking Russian at home, speaking English in most of his life, but kind of brought up on Russian and Soviet cooking at home. He made a lot of jokes about that in his letter to his parents, about kind of being brought up on kasha, on porridge in the mornings and this kind of thing, and then having to eat that now in prison. And he wrote a nice sort of first person account of what his Russian identity means, and sort of thinking about that through cooking or through his mother's recipes and through just Soviet cartoons and that kind of thing that he was brought up with. And then moving back to Russia, that was obviously, or moving to Russia for the first time to live there, was obviously kind of a chance to explore all of that for him as well, both sort of Ukrainian heritage, Russian heritage, and sort of the general kind of history of the historical Soviet experience and how that affected his parents, and helped him, I think, understand them as well a bit better.
So all of that makes him sound like an almost inexplicable target. On the one hand, you've described a particularly sensitive and non-ideological reporter who is writing about the complexity of the situation. You have somebody who is actually there because he is, among other things, in addition to being a reporter, exploring some aspects of his own heritage and background. And all of that leads me back to the question that I know you don't have an answer for, but I'm curious for your thoughts on, which is, why him?
It's just so very hard to know. It's very hard to know. And it, again, is just a very upsetting point for those very reasons that this is someone that has always approached the story with so much care and has always, tried to also report from all corners of Russia. The idea of sitting in Moscow and just telling Russia's story from Moscow was never something that he was comfortable with. It doesn't surprise me that he was traveling the country in this time as well, and this year and last year, because this is something that he really believed in the importance of doing. He had great stories from all over, whether it was sort of sleeping by a campfire in Yakutia in the Far East, in Siberia, or to cover the wildfires there, or traveling to Khabarovsk in the Far East to cover massive protests there that were happening. He went all over the country because he really believed in the importance of kind of letting Russians speak with their own voice and to tell their stories and try and deepen our understanding of what's going on in Russia. So it's for that reason very upsetting indeed. And why him? If it is a hostage taking situation, does it matter who it is? I don't know. On the other hand, if it is to clamp down on even further on the free press and the work of the free press in Russia, if that's one of the, as you suggest, potentially one of the reasons for it, then that's he was working incredibly well in Russia and doing very, very important and very unique work, telling its story during the time of war. So he was also playing an important role in that way.
So I'm curious about your own risk assessment. At the beginning of this conversation, you said that you had been you'd been back to Moscow a number of times for reporting trips since the start of the war. How would you assess your own risk today in light of what happened to Evan? Would you go back for a reporting trip under these circumstances, or is that unthinkable?
I don't know yet. I haven't had time to stop and make the assessment yet. I've been thinking too. I mean, we've just been on a absolute sort of roller coaster with this arrest and with trying to get everything in place and sort of, just doing the campaigning, doing these letters, doing everything. I have not even stopped to think yet about this question. It's definitely an important one. It's I know that a lot of people are thinking about this. I understand the American press pulled their, they publicly spoke about how they pulled their correspondence from Russia for the time being. everybody will be making this assessment. It's obviously had a chilling effect for everyone. I have not yet even stopped to think about it at the moment. It's been too much going on, unfortunately.
So before I let you go, talk for a minute about the United States response. The administration was quick to label him wrongfully detained, which is something that, the government does relatively cautiously. Are there things the U.S. administration, the State Department, haven't done that they should be doing, or is this a situation where everybody's doing the right thing and doing what they can, but at the end of the day, this nobody has control over this situation except the Russian authorities?
I mean, I don't have much visibility. In fact, very few people, I think, have much visibility on what happens in these processes from a political point of view. I understand that from reading a lot of people have been writing who have gone through this experience. Jason Rezaian, David Rode, journalists who have been targeted and held hostage by groups or states in the past have been very kindly kind of offering advice and writing about Evan's case and kind of sharing their own experiences. And one of the things that you understand from that is that it is a very closed process, the negotiation process. If it starts, or entirely the sort of political process is it's a very closed one, even for those closest to Evan, which sometimes becomes difficult. From what I understand from reading these past experiences, becomes even difficult for families and that kind of thing because of how little can be shared about it. It's very sensitive thing. But so we can only see some sort of public moves. They have seemed to be really quick and great. As I was talking about, this wrongfully detained designation happened very swiftly. There does seem to be a lot of attention. We can only call for more attention to this case. We see that Joe Biden has called Evan's mother to have a conversation with the family and spoken about his, dedication to this case. So we sort of, that's kind of what we know, right? Hopefully that kind of pace will continue.
If listeners want to participate in your letter writing campaign, where can they find information about it and how can they get involved?
Yes, I would really call on people to do that. You can email us. We have set up an account. It's freegershkovich@gmail.com. So it's free, Free, and then Gershkovich, Evan's surname, @gmail.com. And we read that inbox. There's 3 or 4 journalists working on this. We translate everything to Russian. We then post these letters to Lefortovo prison in Russia and follow all the procedures. They go through the prison censor and reach Evan, and he reads them. And I think it takes something like 10 or so days for a letter to reach him. But there are many, many coming, and it's really fantastic. I really recommend people to do that. It's also, if people are thinking about what to write, words of support obviously are great. There's also, if you have, he's a big Arsenal fan. He's a huge fan of cooking. He's a fantastic chef. People are writing to him with stories of their kind of experiences in Moscow in the past, or other journalists are telling him stories and things like that. So just some people have even sent puzzles, though we don't recommend that because I'm not sure how the prison authorities would look on that. But yeah, really call on people to take part. It's freegershkovich@gmail.com is the best way to contact us.
So tell me, how do you think the prison authorities would respond if somebody were to send him a photograph of a projection onto the Russian embassy in Washington of a call to free him?
I have no idea. I don't know. We try and enter kind of their minds sometimes to see what, how to approach certain things with letters, but who knows? images do go through though. So it's images do go through, and we are trying to send him messages of support. There is a great image, for example, from the Wall Street Journal newsroom, and the Wall Street Journal has been doing amazing work to campaign for Evan, and more than just a campaign. And there's this great image from their newsroom of their entire staff wearing T-shirts in support of Evan, and with his picture, and just showing their support. I know that a friend of mine who's studying in Boston was running through Boston, I think it was, on a jog, and saw people kind of protesting in those T-shirts and took a picture. We've sent him that, this kind of thing. So we do try and convey to him just how much the world is watching his case.
Well, somebody may engage in such a projection over the next couple of weeks. And if such a projection were to happen, I suspect a image of it might come your way.
Fascinating. I have no idea. A mystery.
We're going to leave it there. Polina, thank you so much for joining us today, and best of luck in this campaign, and in talking about Evan, and in helping him come home.
Thank you so much for taking the time as well. Thanks for your interest in this.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Our audio engineer this episode is the great Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our promotion department is you, the listener. So please do what you can to promote the Lawfare podcast. Share it on Facebook, on Twitter, if Twitter still exists. I wouldn't know. I've been banned. On TikTok, share it on Pinterest, share it on Reddit. Just keep talking everywhere about the Lawfare podcast, and of course, rate and review us wherever you found us. The Lawfare podcast is edited by Jen Patja Howell. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. And as always, thanks for listening.